First, I would like to thank the organizers for including this paper on the program. This is a joint work with Ivan Alfaro, who is a PhD student from Ohio State, and Nick Bloom. So in this paper, we studied the impact of uncertainty shocks for firms' real and financial outcomes, both empirically and theoretically. You're going to see that it's different from Winston's paper. We're going to basically look at uncertainty effect from a macro perspective and focus on quantities. So in particular, we're going to show that the financial frictions are going to amplify the impact on uncertainty shocks, in particular on investment. And the amplification effect of financial frictions to uncertainty shocks is what we refer as the finance uncertainty multiplier effect. So just to give you a broad motivation, so many people believe that uncertainty actually matters. In particular, many people believe that uncertainty shocks is likely to be one of the drivers of the recent Great Recession in 2008 and 2009, and also the slow recovery from 2010 onwards. For example, this is an Economist article by Oliver Blanchard, who basically says that policymakers should focus on reducing uncertainty. And this is also from the former Vanguard CEO, Gavin Davis, who argues that the impact of uncertainty shocks in slowing down the economic recovery seems to be quite substantial. It's also quite topical. So when we look at the last year, there are two major uncertainty shocks. One is Brexit, that seems to matter a lot. And the second is, of course, Donald Trump. So it's just not only the general election process, and also the policies, not only economic policy and various other policies, seems to generate massive uncertainty shocks over the world. And it also seems to be the case that the global economic policy index uncertainty is rising. And this is likely to be driven by a combination of rising income inequality and slowing economic growth that lead to the rising of populist movement, for example, Trump, Brexit, and the National Front in France. And if you look at the last 15 years, there are basically three eras of aggregate uncertainty shocks. One, the recent Great Recession. The uncertainty shock is likely one of the drivers, and slow recovery after that. Now, the recent one is the rise of economic policy index uncertainty. However, for some people, the best evidence that uncertainty matters is that Paul Krugman thinks it isn't that important. So Paul Krugman actually wrote a series of articles on his blog at New York Times about uncertainty shocks. So it started quite politely and civil, but gradually the tone gets intense. So you can see the culture of fraud and uncertainty scam. What they say does not really versus what they mean. Actually, so Paul Krugman has a valid concern. So his skepticism stems over worries over causality. So does uncertainty cause recessions or the reverse? In our empirical analysis, we're going to try to address endogeneity concern, which is kind of a big deal in the literature. We're going to do an IV estimation. So does uncertainty also impact finance? Well, it seems that media also noticed that corporations pile on cash while uncertainty is high. So just to give you a quick idea of what data looks like at the aggregate level, here we are plotting a bunch of real and financial outcomes at the aggregate level and VIX. So the top two panels, when VIX is high, investment falls and employment growth falls. Turning to financials, when VIX is high, total corporate debt falls. In particular, short-term debt falls more than long-term debt. There seems to be a term structure effect. And firms also cut dividend, and firms raise cash holdings. So what do we do in this paper? Theoretically, we're going to present you a dynamic model. It's going to be a partial group model in which there are heterogeneous firms. We're going to have both real and financial adjustment cost. So firms are making a bunch of decisions, real and financial, real financial side. We're going to calibrate the model and quantify the impact on uncertainty shocks. On the empirical side, we're going to focus on the IV estimation. In particular, we're going to instrument firm uncertainty by estimating firms' exposures to a bunch of instruments, currencies, aggregate oil price changes, and policy uncertainty. So what do we find? Empirically, on the real side, we're going to show that uncertainty, firms with high uncertainty cut investment and also cut employment and output growth. Financial side, firms cut total debt. In particular, they cut short-term debt more than long-term debt. They also cut equity payout and increase cash holding. Theoretically, we're going to show that by adding financial frictions to a standard neoclassic model with real frictions only, financial frictions almost doubles the impact of uncertainty shocks. So the finance uncertainty multiplier in our quantitative model is about 2. What is the policy implication? The policy implication is that financial stabilization is going to be important to reduce the impact on uncertainty shocks. So I'm going to first talk about the model and then go through some of the results to illustrate the basic mechanism. Then we'll talk about the empirical analysis. So the model is going to be a partial equilibrium model. So we're not going to speak to aggregate consumption, investment, output, but we're going to have a cross-sectional firms in which the cross-sectional heterogeneity is driven by firm idiosyncratic productivity. Firms make real decisions and financial decisions. On the real side, it's capital investment and labor. Financial side, short-term debt, long-term debt, and cash. Of course, firms are going to issue equity as well. Both real and financial decisions are going to be costly to adjust. On that side, both short-term debt and long-term debt are collateralized. There are 2 types of shock in the model. One is the shock to the first moment, which is the level shock to TFP. The other is the second moment shock. So I'll first talk about the real side of the model, then I'll move to the financing side. So real technology is quite standard in the macro literature. So output production is a constant return to scale technology. Z delta is the productivity shock that is made up of both aggregate and firm-specific productivity. K is capital, H is labor. Firms also face a downward demand sloping curve. So when you combine the two, that gives to a decreasing return to scale revenue function, which is denoted by S. So these are firms' real frictions. So I plus is positive investment. I minus is negative investment, which is essentially firms are selling machines and equipment. So there are 2 types of real frictions. One is partial irreversibility, which is captured by this parameter. Basically, when firms sell their existing machines and equipment, there's a discount, for example, due to Lemon's problem in the secondary market. There is also fixed cost on investment that is fixed, which is not really dependent on the amount of investment. So these are kind of standard in the macro literature. Now I'm going to talk about the uncertainty structure. So there are 2 productivities. One is firm-specific productivity. The other is aggregate productivity. Both of these 2 follow an AR1 process. What is really important here is that for firm-specific productivity and aggregate productivity, their conditional volatility are time-varying, which is illustrated basically in Winston's paper. And both of these time-varying stochastic volatility follow a 2-stage Markov process. Now let me turn to the financial side of the economy. First, let me talk about debt financing, then I'll move to equity financing. So firms in this model issue both short-term debt and long-term debt. Short-term debt is just a periodic debt. And the negative of that is cash holding. That is denoted by BS. Long-term debt is modeled as a sinking fund. So firms are going to issue long-term debt every period, and existing long-term debt is also retired as a constant rate, which is captured by this parameter theta. 1 over theta is basically determines the length of the long-term debt contract. Both short-term debt and long-term debt are collateralized. In particular, we assume that the tightness of short-term debt is going to be smaller than the long-term debt, meaning that this is actually mostly empirically driven because in the data, short-term debt is less than long-term debt. Both short-term debt and long-term debt issues are costly. So you can think about these costs as, for example, that not only includes issuance cost, but also indirect cost. For example, the cost associated with short-term debt liquidity risk, and the agency cost associated with long-term debt. Turning to equity financing, the firm's budget constraint is given by the following: the after-tax profit plus a bunch of tax shield on capital depreciation, tax shield on short-term debt interest payment, and long-term coupon payment, minus all the adjustment costs on investment, plus newly issued short-term debt and long-term debt and cash change, minus all the financial adjustment costs. So whenever firms are issuing dividends, they're going to be positive. It's going to be dividend. Whenever dividend payout is negative, it's considered as season equity offering. In particular, we follow the existing literature, assuming that season equity issuance is costly. So in the end, the effective cash flow is given by firm's payout minus external equity issuance cost. So that's basically the rough sketch of the model. Now I'm going to turn to some of the model results. So we calibrate the model at monthly frequency. There are a bunch of parameters, basically 2 groups. The first group can be determined pretty much by following the existing literature. For the financial frictions, we make sure that this calibration is reasonable in the sense that the implied debt issuance cost is roughly consistent with the literature, and also the short-term debt to long-term debt ratio, the fraction of firms holding cash is about consistent with the model. In the interest of time, I'm going to just focus on the key model prediction, which is the impact of uncertainty shock, impact of financial frictions, amplification effect of financial frictions to uncertainty effect. There are lots of trade-offs, but in the interest of time, I'm just going to focus on these optimal policy functions of investment. So the first picture I'm going to show you is the optimal investment policies implied by the model when we shut down all the debt adjustment cost and equity adjustment cost. So effectively, it's kind of close to a standard neoclassical model with time-varying uncertainty. Here, we know that the basic prediction, because it's costly to adjust investment, and there's an SS band. When we move to a high uncertainty state, the SS band gets enlarged, and investment falls. That's a standard prediction. We all know that. Next, I'm going to add financial frictions, meaning that I'm going to add debt adjustment cost and equity adjustment cost. It turns out that the SS band gets enlarged even more, and hence investment falls. So what's the intuition? The intuition is that, well, the standard neoclassical investment model with real frictions and time-varying uncertainty, there's one option. But here, with financial frictions, there are two, and both of them are costly to adjust. So firms are going to be extra cautious, and hence SS band gets enlarged, and investment falls. So that's basically the model mechanism. Next, I'm going to show you some simulation exercise to illustrate a bunch of mechanisms in the model about financial variables and real variables. So basically, we're going to run a regression on the simulated data. Left-hand side, that's just a change of real and financial outcomes. Right-hand side, it's changes in the current volatility. Here, we're going to use realized stock return volatility implied the model, basically to match the data. Because in the data, we're going to use realized vol as a proxy for uncertainty. So it seems that the model, the benchmark model with both real and financial frictions, does a reasonably good job in capturing, for example, the negative impact of uncertainty shock for investment, for employment, and firms with high uncertainty cut debt, cut short-term debt more than long-term debt. And this happens in the model because short-term debt, you have to pay it periodically, but long-term debt is just a coupon payment. It turns out that short-term debt, the amount of short-term debt is much larger than the long-term debt. And both of them are costly to issue, and equity is costly to finance, so you really have to cut short-term debt more than long-term debt. Firms with higher uncertainty also increase their cash holding. This is due to a precautionary saving motive because external financing is costly, and you really cannot just sell your equipment machines to smooth out shocks. I'm going to show you a bunch of two comparative analyses here. One is that we turned off real frictions, meaning that we're going to turn off partial irreversibility on investment and fixed cost on investment. It turns out that the impact of uncertainty shocks on investment drops a lot, which is not surprising. Then firms are going to still cut their total debt because debt financing are still costly. But there's no term structure effect anymore because now firms can actually sell their machines and equipment to pay off their existing short-term debt. Next, we're going to shut down both debt and equity financing cost. What happens is that the impact of uncertainty shocks for investment drops by a half. Another way of saying that is that when we add financial frictions to a standard model with real frictions only, the financial frictions roughly doubles the impact of uncertainty shocks. So the finance uncertainty multiplier here is about 2. And if we look at, for example, on cash, because now there are no financial frictions, firms have no incentive to save on cash in equilibrium. And there's no distinction between short-term debt versus long-term debt. All right. And the baseline model does not have explicit SDF, and as an extension, we incorporate an SDF. It seems to be the model produce a stronger effect on investment due to a time-varying risk premium. Remember that Paul Krugman seems to be suspicious about this causality of the impact of uncertainty shocks. So our view is that, well, it's likely that both effects are there, reverse causality, and so it can be the case that uncertainty causes investment to fall, and at the same time, the fall in GDP and the fall in investment will further increase uncertainty effect. it's likely both channels at play in the data, but we're going to focus on first one, which is the causal impact on uncertainty on investment. So the data is standard in computes that data, and we use two proxies for uncertainty. One is realized vol, the other is implied vol. These are IV estimation. We're going to instrument firm level uncertainty by estimating firm's exposure to a bunch of instruments. These instruments are oil uncertainty, currency uncertainty, and economic policy uncertainty by Baker, Bloom, and Davis, a recent QJE paper. So the basic idea is that different firms and different industries are exposed differently to oil shock. So for example, energy-intensive firms and industries are more exposed to oil price movement than retail firms and business service firms. And similarly, firms and industries have different trading intensities with foreign countries will be exposed differently to bilateral exchange rate movement. And similarly, industries that are heavily reliant on government contracts will be more exposed to aggregate policy uncertainty. So specifically, we're going to do the following. We're going to estimate firms' exposure at the SIC's 3-digit level. On the left-hand side, it's risk-adjusted return by adjusting a Carhart full-factor model, but the results actually are robust even for raw returns. On the left-hand side, these are changes in our instrument, okay? Changes in oil price and changes in currencies. So when we estimate these betas, we're going to calculate a composite term by multiplying the absolute value of beta and implied volatility of those instruments. For policy uncertainty exposure, we're going to calculate the industry average share that's coming from the government contract. And similarly, we're going to multiply the absolute value of that exposure with the economic policy index. Just to recap, we're going to have 9 instruments, and we're going to run the standard 2-stage IV regression. First stage, we're going to estimate, we're going to instrument firm volatility by using those 9 instruments. And second stage, we run a panel regression. Left-hand side, changes of real variables and financial variables. Right-hand side is the change in instrument volatility plus a bunch of controls, and also our first moment, the first moment of our instruments. This is kind of our main results on investment. The first specification is OLS. Firms with higher uncertainty reduce their investment, but it's subject to endogeneity concern. That's implied vol. It's significant as well. The main specification that we focus on in these papers is IV realized multivariate regression, and volatility remains significant. What is the economic magnitude? The economic magnitude here is that 2 standard deviation rise of uncertainty, firm level uncertainty, implies 4 to 6% drop in average investment at firm level. It seems to be modest compared to firm level investment volatility, which is 20%. But recall the first figure that I showed you, the drop in aggregate investment during the Great Recession is actually 2 to 3%. So this 4 to 6% drop for the average investment is actually quite sizable. So how good is our instrument? It turns out that the first stage estimate, the F statistic, is pretty much above 25, and the over-identified restriction test, Hansen test, the p-value is also pretty big. And we actually do some of different tests by looking at this instrument one by one. Most of them are positive and significant, meaning that they are indeed relevant and significant. Turning to other real outcomes for investment, the results are pretty strong. And intangible investment, which is R&D plus SG&A expenses. SG&A expenses is due to a paper by Dimitri and Andrea. So we use that as well. It turns out to be quite significant. Sales growth is also quite significant, even in multivariate IV regression. Now let's turn to financials. Total debt is also quite strong. Firms with higher uncertainty, they cut their debt in the multivariate IV regression for both realized vol and implied vol. Equity payout, firms with high uncertainty reduce their equity payout, even in multivariate IV regression. Cash holding turns out to be not that significant in the IV regression. And this is partly because we use a different definition from the literature on cash. We use growth rate of cash. Well, in the literature, it seems that people use change in cash over AT, total asset. That seems to make a difference. But we do growth rate because we want to make things consistent across all our variable definitions. Short-term to long-term debt, firms do cut short-term debt more than long-term debt in the OLS regression, but not so significant in the multivariate regression. In the paper, we do a laundry list of robustness checks. Here's one of them. We drop IVs one by one and to look at the implied results. And it's just robust. And the F test is pretty strong as before. And the Hansen test produces pretty big p-values, meaning that the residuals, we cannot really reject the noun that residuals and our instruments are uncorrelated. All right. So just a quick recap of our empirical results. On the real side, factor inputs, they are down. Financials, they cut debt, in particular cut short-term debt more than long-term debt. They also, firms with higher uncertainty, cut equity, increase cash holding. And hopefully this gentleman would be happier. Then recall our mean prediction. Our mean prediction is that financial frictions amplify the impact on uncertainty shocks. Do we find any evidence in the data? So what we do is that we're going to look at financial constrained firms versus financially unconstrained firms, for example. And we're going to use the measure that people use in the corporate finance literature. There are two that we use in this paper. The one is due to a recent, following recent GFE paper. Basically, we define financial constraint as firms with debt but without public debt rating. And the second is size. Okay. And then we interact uncertainties with the financial constraint. It turns out that it's quite promising. So the effect of uncertainty shocks is even stronger for financially constrained firms. So these are the panel regressions. The last one is that we aggregate investment into two groups. One is constrained, the other is unconstrained. And then we look at the impact of uncertainty shocks during the financial crisis, the recent Great Recession. It turns out that if we look at pre-recessions, these two groups of firms' investment are pretty much aligned together. But in financial crisis, constrained firms' investment do drop substantially stronger than the unconstrained, than the less constrained firms. Of course, there are many different interpretations. This is actually not surprising in the literature. There's one fact, but there are a bunch of theories on it. But we argue that this is consistent with our theory, which predicts that financial frictions amplify the impact on uncertainty shocks. So let me conclude. So we have two parts of the paper. We have a model that shows that financial frictions amplify the impact on uncertainty shocks, and it seems to be quite substantial. Empirically, we show that based on our IV regression, uncertainty shocks do have a causal impact for real and financial outcomes. A couple of words on ongoing work. So the model is partial equilibrium. Basically, it's a trade-off. We focus on the cross-sectional firms. So firm-specific shock here are AR1, so you do, we focus on that, then we sacrifice GE. But it's likely that if we extend the model to GE, basically prices are going to be endogenous. If you think about these standard macro workhouse models, wages are kind of rigid and prices are kind of rigid. So we expect that our main results are still going to hold. But if you do GE with a non-trivial cross-sectional firms, you will have to do Krusell-Smith, which is going to be quite painful. Very likely we're going to estimate the model parameters, do a simulated math of moments. I think Tony may want to say more about that. And because the calibration so far, we are still revising on it. And we do look forward to the comments by Tony. Thank you very much.